Great. I think we could start as people continue to come in. Firstly, a warm welcome to all of you from all around the world that have joined us, and a warm welcome to our panelists today. Thank you for taking the time to join this very interesting discussion. My name is Tuga Alaskari. I'm an advisor at the Secretariat of the InsuResilience Global Partnership, and we're delighted to be co-hosting this event together with the Insurance Development Forum. Nick Moody, who you'll meet soon, is here representing the IDF. Today we'll be discussing the development impact of risk analytics, and this session will explore a range of open risk modeling initiatives in the development and humanitarian context. We have some very interesting panelists joining us, and we hope to have a very interactive discussion. We'll begin today with a brief introduction to the development of impact of risk analytics report, which was recently published. We'll do this together, myself and Nick Moody, who is the editor of this report. We'll then move on to a panel discussion, and this will be moderated by Augusto Hidalgo from Willis Towers Watson in Asia. He joins us from the Philippines, and he'll also introduce the panelists. The session is designed to be entertaining, informative, and most of all interactive. We will be using Mentimeter, so if you could already perhaps go to www.menti.com, we'll soon share a code, and we'd love to hear from you. In addition to that, we encourage you to use the chat function to pose questions to the panelists. We will be stopping at different intervals in the panel session, and we will be directing some of those questions. If we don't get to answer your question today, Nick Moody, a leading expert in this topic, has very kindly promised to answer every single question that is posed today. So do leave your name and your organization so that we can contact you. But also we will be developing a short report on this session, and we will include all the questions and the answers. So to begin with, I'd like to start by introducing the InsuResilience Global Partnership very briefly. If we could go on to the next slide. Sorry, and then the next slide after that. So the InsuResilience Global Partnership was established at the UNFCCC COP23 in 2017. It's an initiative that was born out of a decision taken by the G20 and a separate decision taken out of V20 countries who recognized the need for a global partnership to drive efforts to strengthen the resilience of the poor and vulnerable from the impacts of climate shocks and disasters. They aim to achieve this through prearranged risk financing and insurance mechanisms. Today, the partnership is comprised of over 90 members, including G20 and V20 countries, multilateral organizations, civil society, academia, and the private sector. This grand coalition of actors are working towards what we call Vision 2025. This vision articulates a common vision and a set of targets, which includes 500 million poor and vulnerable people covered against disasters and climate shocks by prearranged risk financing and insurance mechanisms by 2025. I'll hand over to Nick now to introduce the Insurance Development Forum.
Thank you, Tuga. Thanks very much. So good day to everybody, and thank you for joining the session. A quick word on the Insurance Development Forum before I move on to the report. So it is in many ways a mirror image of the InsuResilience Global Partnership that Tuga's just described. It was formed, excuse me, it was formed shortly after Sendai, as the result of an initiative by a UN political champions group. And its aim is to be a portal to private sector risk management, risk analytics expertise, and also its financial capacity in support both of the InsuResilience vision and also the 2030 agenda. One of the groups within the IDF is a risk modeling steering group, which is made up of members drawn from across all sectors, so development, humanitarian, public and private sectors. Its membership is risk professionals, risk analytics practitioners. And the genesis of this report is really because in conversations across that group, particularly coming out of the Climate Action Summit at New York, we all felt that there is a problem in the system of distribution of risk understanding. that the decision makers worldwide who need it most do not have access to the risk analytics capability that they need in order to be able to own the analysis. Next slide, please, Chanel. So as a result of that, we drew up a concept for this report, which is, as I said, called the Development Impact of Risk Analytics. It was contributed to by 30 organizations, and basically it's one large theory of change. It argues for the accelerated growth of risk understanding where it is needed the most around the world as an empowering principle. It's very evidence-driven. There are a lot of case studies that have been contributed in from members of the panel, apart from anyone else. But also there are hundreds of references and lots of examples throughout the report, as all good theories of change should be. It focuses on analytics that are from which you can derive financial metrics. Not only that, but it is important that it should have those financial metrics. And the reason for that is not simply because of financial instruments, but also because it is, in that respect, it is movements of money that make it possible to implement social impact programs, for example. It was necessary to put boundaries around the work, and so we focused in particular on what we felt were the three most important responses to risk. The first of those being risk prevention, in other words, investment in risk reduction. The second being risk transfer, and the third being humanitarian anticipatory action. Risk analytics underpins all of those three things, and we'll come on to an example around risk transfer in just a second. So the report does not make the case that qualitative risk analytics is all you need to make good decisions. It absolutely recognizes that you need local knowledge and experience, and also expert judgment. But it contends that you offer, if you have a good risk analytics capability, then you significantly reduce your uncertainty. And in the space that's left, that's the room where expert judgment can be applied, and that's where the real kind of human element of decision-making takes place. Next slide, please. So Tuga, over to you for your example around risk transfer.
Thank you. So as Nick has mentioned, the DERO paper takes a look at the full cycle of risk management, looking at risk prevention, risk transfer, and humanitarian assistance. In this slide, we take the example of risk transfer to lay out a problem. One example of some of the work that both the InsuResilience Global Partnership and the Insurance Development Forum are concerned with. No doubt, participants of such a meeting would be sharing a concern for the impact of climate shocks. The World Bank and GFDRR estimate that disaster forces 26 million people into poverty each year. We also know that the impacts of disasters on lives, livelihoods, and assets are not evenly distributed, with a large protection gap concentrated in emerging economies. In this context, sovereign disaster risk financing tools, including insurance, can offer one approach to strengthen rapid response to disaster shocks and finance disaster recovery. By linking early warning, disaster planning, and predictable financing, resources may be mobilized rapidly and predictably where they are needed most. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Tuga. So let me quickly run through the key messages and recommendations of the paper. As I've mentioned, the first message is that there's a paradox that the greatest investment and resources, commitment of resources in risk analytics is in the global north, and yet the greatest vulnerabilities, as we all know, throughout this UR 2020 forum, are in the global south. So there's a problem there. Secondly, I think in many webinars we've all been to recently, we've seen evidence that organizations are proposing a strategic approach to risk. We hear lots of talk about compound risk, multi-hazard views of risk, systemic risk. And yet the reality is that in the system, the development system, we are drip feeding single hazard, single project metrics without any real transfer of risk understanding. That transfer of risk understanding is important, but we see many barriers in the way of that, including, for example, cost, complexity, inefficiencies in the system. But we can see how some of those barriers might be removed. And we can see how the private sector expertise and resources can be brought to bear. After all, for the private sector, risk understanding at the aggregate and transactional level has been an absolute survival skill. Next slide, please. So I'm very conscious that we don't want to take up the panel's time, so let me run through just a subset of these recommendations from the paper. And I think maybe Tuga, you had a couple in mind that you would like to talk about.
I'd like to talk about empowerment, recommendation number 2. The paper recommends that a collaborative approach to disaster risk modelling would support better decision-making by enabling cross-sector collaboration and empowerment of local decision makers. Another very interesting recommendation is number 6, which calls for people-centered metrics. Within that, this includes that the recommendation that data must be sex disaggregated to enable a gender focus. This is something that's very important for the InsuResilience Global Partnership, and it would be remiss of me not to mention that we are launching a Centre of Excellence for Gender Smart Solutions on Monday, and would be looking to work very closely with the IDF to look at how we could start to support this recommendation. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Tuga. So 2 that I might pick out in particular are around public-private collaboration, and the paper makes some very specific recommendations about that. And also the accelerated adoption of open risk modeling technologies. These are technologies that already exist, open source platforms, but also the principles and the open data standards that go with them, which accelerate user choice, the ability to integrate local research, and you'll hear more about all of this on the panel that's coming up. Next slide, please. So this is a campaign, it's not just a paper, and particularly in the context of COP26, we propose 3 major calls to action as a result of this report. The first is the accelerated adoption of open risk modeling platforms and standards, and we think that's achievable by the public sector, particularly the development sector, including these as conditions in their procurement processes. Secondly, the launch of a strategic fund that countries can apply to in order to get international support for developing their risk analytics functions, and crowding in the private sector as part of that in order to achieve that cross-sector collaboration that's so essential. And thirdly, the launch of a public-private entity that would deliver the capacity building and other aims of that strategic fund. And again, that would be a public-private effort. Right, we're running up, coming right up now to the panel, so I'm going to ask for the slides to be closed there, but I think, Tuga, you have a poll for us to go through now, don't you?
Yes, thank you, Nick. So if you look in the chat, I have put the code up for the Menti. So if you go to menti.com and you can use the code 8381499, which also appears on your screen. And please could you answer this question: what do you think is the most important contribution of risk analysis to sustainable development? Is it 1, it provides a strategic view for setting development priorities? 2, prices risk for green investment and residual risk transfer? 3, builds a shared language of risk for cross-sector collaboration? You can see the answers coming in. Please do submit your responses. We'll give that a couple more minutes. See the responses coming in. Quite a few for number 1, and then also quite a lot for number 3. I think this will give the panel something to reflect on as well. This is great. Do keep your responses coming in. We will include this in the report. So if you've had some technical problems and are only just getting in, please do submit your answer. Great. Well, I'm also conscious of time, and I think this brings us to the panel now. So Nick, should I? Yep, I'll hand over to Augusta now. Great.
Thank you, Tuga.
Augusta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tuga. Thank you, Nick. I'm Augusto Hidalgo. I work for Willis Towers Watson, and we provide a lot of consulting on loss modeling analytics to development banks for the benefit of sovereigns. And I would guess at a guess, our audience would be mainly civil servants, people in the public sector, and a few private sector. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel members today. We have Ana Beatriz Acevedo from Universidad EAFIT in Colombia. We have Litea Biotoko from the Secretariat of the Pacific Community. We have Catherine Miles, a consultant to InsuResilience Secretariat on gender topics. We have Claire Harris from the START Network, technical lead. And we have Paul Mazie from JBA Consulting, which is a private sector loss modeling and analytics, predictive analytics company. I'll give you a few words about to get us started, and we'll turn to the panel. There will be two 15-minute sessions each, time permitting, with some question and answer from the audience, which Tuga and Nick will be sort of shepherding for us. So inside of 30 minutes or so, we hope to deliver entertainment and information to you relevant to some decisions, I think, that would tie in with your responses to the Mentimeter quiz. And that seems to be sort of decision-making support is part of what I understand about those responses. And let me try to sort of intro in to this. So I just got off a call with the Development Bank hosting a consultation with South Asian sovereign just an hour ago, and which is describing that the work of analytics really results in something called an annual aggregate loss, which means what is the bill that you expect to pay any given year after a disaster, let's say a climate hydrometeorological event, let's say flood. And to policymakers, to government decision makers, and particularly to finance ministries, that is not really a finance question as much as it is a liquidity question. You would like to have an idea of where the money is going to come from in the immediate aftermath. Of course, I'm preaching to the crowd here. You all know that, having lived through it. But it serves to underline that analytics, I think, and developing your own risk view of your own risk profiles for disaster, infectious disease, climate risk, have to do with just this. What is the bill? We know that the government can pay for it ultimately, but what is the bill in the immediate for a quicker recovery? That's one point. The second point that I'd like to lead in, to invite you to consider prioritizing risk analytics, is simply the weight of money. We mentioned COP26. Last week, I started reading Mark Carney's architecture of a private finance framework that he's going to be presenting at COP26 in Glasgow. And I think it's worth it to underline that a good view of risk, understanding your own annual aggregate losses, let's say, will be more attractive to the fire hose of capital that we think is going to be flowing through from OECD countries to the developing world, but as well, the trillions of dollars that the private sector is willing to bring to bear on this grave, grave problem. So if you think about it that way, the why is the more transparent you are about your risk and resilience through analytics, the easier it is for holders of capital, donors, funders to send that money your way. And frankly, there's a competition for that capital. With that in mind, we're going to enter into two 15-minute sessions. One is about risk understanding, your view of risk, and how to overcome that. That's 15 minutes. The second one is choosing the right tools. Let me open right up here with that first segment and turn to the panel and say, in terms of this risk report, in terms of helping the audience understand some of the barriers for local risk understanding. Perhaps I'll ask a question about the benefit to a risk owner. So a sovereign, somebody managing a public sector entity. What is the benefit to a risk owner of developing their own view of risk? And maybe I'll ask Claire from the START network to kick us off, and then turn to Catherine to provide different views and lenses on risk to begin with. Claire?
Thanks, Augusto. So I guess with that question, I kind of think about it, what are the implications if they don't essentially own that view of risk? So if we take it back to really simple terms, imagine that you have just had your house flooded and no one comes to help you. There's no support for you. You can imagine you're angry and you're asking why. And it could be in risk financing terms in lower income countries that financing needed to mount that response to support you and your family in the country didn't reach you because something happened with the analytics that triggered that financing. That's a real possibility. And in that case, the answer could be because the risk model that triggers the funding and action deemed you and your family not to be as vulnerable to the level that warranted funding for support. Or it could be that the model and the skill with the model was not strong enough and in this case missed the risk that your family was facing. So that's the reality essentially of risk analytics getting it wrong, and whether or not you're a government who has the responsibility for those people, or you're the risk owner of those people. You know, the ultimate risk owner is the person at risk, but governments are seen as the aggregator of that potentially. So if you don't have that ownership essentially of what the risk view is, you have no answer for those people who have suffered or have been impacted by the limitations of our analytics and the limitations of our models. That's not to say that the right decisions were not made and that the right thresholds were not put in place, but the ability of that person who's been impacted by those decisions is severely diminished. Their power within the system is severely diminished if they are not part of that system, or they have not been involved in some way in the design and view of risk to them and their communities. So you would have to kind of think, you know, if the model is closed, how does the person closed or developed in a different place to the people who are actually at the sharp end of the response? You kind of have to think to yourself, like, how do they hold whoever is holding the risk analytics to account? How does a person on the ground hold their duty bearers to account if the analytics didn't respond as it should do to a situation, or if it did, but decisions were made around thresholds and things like that that they didn't feel was correct? So essentially using risk analytics in the new way we are in terms of humanitarian action creates like a whole new operational and ethics framework around the use of analytics. And it plays into issues around rights, around democracy, data safeguarding, and all of these kinds of things. So by removing risk analytics from the people who are at risk or the owners of risk in terms of a government, then you start to reduce the power and reduce the accountability within the system, I'd say quite significantly. A couple of examples of, you know, by allowing people to own their analytics, to define the design criteria on them, you know, you're able to then make sure there's certain elements within those risk analytics that are present. So why do you want the data in the first place? What is it you want to do once the money is there? Is it coming at the right time? Are you monitoring the right data to allow that trigger to happen and for the money to be there when you need it? And what do you need to do to try to protect people at that point? So what's the window? Also, you know, why are people vulnerable? Why are they at risk? What do they need and when do they need it? All of that has to aggregate up into the analytics you use to monitor and trigger. An example would be in the ARC replica program in Senegal, where the government and ARC were using a single cash crop to model the risk of drought. When Start Network came along with the replica program, we had to advocate really strongly on behalf of communities at risk to include millet in there, which is the crop that most people eat. But by removing that kind of viewpoint or risk viewpoint out of that model, it meant that those kinds of drought impacts on food insecurity were not being picked up as well. So I think, just to kind of finish, I think it's really important that people can design and identify what they need from analytics and what is the actual purpose of them in terms of response and protection of people at risk. And only then can there be kind of a real accountability in the system of how it's set up and whose risk is actually reflected and supported through the action that flows from it.
So an owner of risk owes it to their vulnerable populations, and we talk about InsuResilience's 500 million challenge. Some of those vulnerable populations are almost ignored in the statistics at some time. So I'd like to invite Catherine to give us a viewpoint on maybe some lenses of the types of data that owners of risk could consider.
Sure. So just picking up really on Claire's point around a real barrier to local risk understanding being these closed models. It means that we don't know at the moment necessarily what kind of data is then incorporated into them, and the choices are being made around that. And so what having an open risk model can allow us to do is understand the extent to which different vulnerabilities are accounted for, whether that's between women and men, recognizing there are, and there's significant evidence showing that there are gender differential vulnerabilities, for instance, in terms of climate change and disaster risks and impacts. And also just in terms of sex disaggregated data, maybe also thinking of it in terms of age difference in vulnerabilities as well. And also in terms of exposure, with migration, for instance, it can be that particular groups are disproportionately impacted by any kind of disaster, depending on where it happens. And so by having this open models, you're able to see the extent to which these differences in vulnerabilities are accounted for. And that gives a really richer understanding of what these risks are and how they differentially affect people. And then also with that more people-centric approach to risk understanding, you're able to then have more tailored response strategies to meet the needs of these different vulnerable populations. So that's sort of the main point that I wanted to make. I just wanted to add that a key barrier that I see also came through this report around local risk understanding, and certainly from the gender perspective, getting that reflected better into risk analytics, is actually the low levels of women's economic participation in these roles. And that could be just in general, but very specifically in some of the technical functions, whether that's as actuaries or generally in the insurance sector, or in leadership positions in like disaster management committees as well. So that needs to also be addressed to ensure that these diverse perspectives of risk understanding are built in to these models. And certainly there's a lot of evidence that can also support better governance as well.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think I'm going to ask the audience's forbearance as we're on 15 minutes for this first piece. With that in mind, I'm going to ask, moving from sort of a risk owner's understanding of its own risk and the assumptions behind the outputs, to the owner of the risk itself, maybe Litea could give us a view on some of the challenges they may have found in the Pacific around developing a risk function for a sovereign. And with your permission, maybe a response from the supply side, Paul, to some of the issues that are coming out here as a supplier of loss analytics. Natea?
Thank you. Well, for the Pacific, particularly with the number of our national agencies, the capacity to be able to actually conduct your own risk analytics don't really exist. So a lot of the analysis work is actually done by consultancy firms, and is really for a purpose. And often the results are actually not reusable. So what we're finding is that there's very little flexibility in countries being able to reuse and reapply a lot of the products that are coming out, but also being able to then understand it to its full extent. So, really strengthening that capacity around how you go from risk analytics to the decision making, and ensuring that there's that connectivity between the producer of the risk information and the person who's actually making a decision for it. So actually understanding how those decision flows are within government, and ensuring that you're able to not to create a secondary process for being able to actually embed those risk considerations into planning, but really to try and strengthen that decision-making process itself.
Thanks very much. You can see some of the issues that some of our neighbors are having with the thought of developing a risk function. Anna, I think we'll come to sort of your view in a second, but maybe I'd like to sort of sharply turn to Paul for a minute or two on sort of what it's like to be providing service to sovereigns and other ones that may not yet have an own view of risk, and how you see the future.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Augusto. So to pick up on some of the other points people have made, I guess it's probably useful to look at the history of this and recall that the modeling community has 25 or more years now of experience of addressing these sort of conversations between ourselves and the reinsurers and the insurance industry. So that dialogue has gone on there, and that's built a lot of expertise and experience. And I think we're now at the point where that knowledge is just starting to be passed on into this new community of international development. And so there is an awareness of that needing to happen. I think that's the key to passing over this knowledge now. That it's that dialogue between the two sides. So the risk modelers being much more open about the details of what they're doing and how the models work, explaining the assumptions, the strengths, the limitations, and getting that knowledge back from the risk owners that we've talked about in terms of understanding more about the local context, providing opportunities for that local context to be worked into the outputs, and we're seeing some of that sort of sharing of language starting to happen, I think. So if you look at the sort of language that's used around new funding proposals, say, and meetings like this, people are starting to talk in the same sort of language and starting to understand the point of view of others in that chain, and I think that will continue to evolve over time as everyone in that kind of chain comes closer together and there's more dialogue.
Thank you very much, Paul. So more opportunities to engage public and private sector. I'm going to ask maybe Anna now to take us home on this panel, and maybe describe some of your experiences in making those analytics available to owners, and what good experiences you've had. Anna.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm a professor of a university in Medellin, Colombia, in South America, and I was introduced to seismic risk assessment in 2013 when I was invited to be part of a project of the GEM Foundation, which is the Global Aircraft Model Foundation. And this project was to assess seismic risk in South America. At that point, I didn't have any knowledge about seismic risks, but I was introduced to this program, and I was also introduced to OpenQuake, which is an open source software, which is for free, and anyone can use it to assess risk. So with this introduction, I realized that I had where I acquired some knowledge, but I also had the possibility to use a very useful tool to perform risk analysis. So that encouraged me to continue increasing my knowledge on seismic risk. And also, I had open data that was available. I was able to understand the assumptions. I have models. So with that, I began to run my own analysis. Once I was able to reproduce this analysis, I understood that I had the capability to perform risk analysis. And then I began to create my own models, which, by the way, they're all free. So if anyone needs them, they're open to everyone. And when I realized that I had this knowledge, I decided that it was a good time to transfer that knowledge to my students. So from 2017 up to now, I've been teaching seismic risk assessment. Of course, we compute risk metrics. And this is to graduate and undergraduate students of civil engineering in Colombia. So now we have a generation of students, well, many of them are professionals right now, that they understand risk, they know how to assess the risk, they're able to generate their own models, and this really give us an opportunity to really generate our own knowledge on risk, be aware of the risk, understand the metrics, for example. And I think this is very interesting for us, those from the South, to really know how to perform our own analysis.
Thank you very much, Anna. So in conclusion, I guess we all have to enroll in Anna's university, which is a great example of the academe stepping up in order to increase our understanding. I think we'll move now to maybe some questions from the floor, if there are, Tuga or Nick.
Yes, so we do have one from Shihui Zun, and it's very interesting. It's related to artificial intelligence. It's, can artificial intelligence, machine learning, develop the cognitive capacity and capabilities of risk analytics software to become sensitized to the lived experiences, sociocultural contextual backgrounds, and linguistic semantics of suffering and loss from adverse risk-related phenomenon consequences in order to upgrade such programs from merely depicting such risk analytics data as passively clinically detached data into meaningfully insightful descriptive iterations of the human condition. She says this will be useful for stakeholders, risk owners, and risk analytics service providers. It's a long one, but basically, can artificial intelligence give us that have the machine learning develop a better understanding of risk that can depict the lived experiences, socio-cultural, contextual backgrounds, and linguistic semantics to enhance the data that we use?
Yeah, I wonder, thanks very much. Wow. We're going to have a week-long seminar on just this question. But maybe in partial answer, of course, anyone on the panel is invited to respond. But perhaps if anybody has a viewpoint on sort of how artificial intelligence is helpful in understanding better these risks, that would be most welcome.
I think I've a couple of points on it. I think AI definitely will have a place and will be very useful in some respects on this. So essentially, like AI, I think could be very helpful when you've got a lot of complex, different kinds of risk data coming in, and you're trying to manage that and understand what's agreeing, what's not agreeing, all this kind of thing. Like AI to enable better decision making, but maybe not to make those decisions, but to enable humans to make better decisions with that information. But I think sometimes there's a line as well, I think, where you become too automated, too automatic, too artificial intelligence-y, that the understanding then gets taken away from people because it's able to combine lots of different things together that everybody loses sight of other people's or other information and opinion because it's all been put into this one big, AI engine, essentially. So I think there's definitely a place for it, but I think we have to be quite careful that by using AI, we don't actually cloud things more from risk owners and people at risk with that information?
Augusta, I'd say, and I'm no expert in AI or machine learning, but I'd say we probably need to be wary here that a lot of these methods presumably rely on quite a lot of data, and I think that's one of the big challenges here. Something that comes out in the report is something that we find as we start to work in different countries and start to try and understand different vulnerabilities is actually the data to base those relationships on is possibly, arguably, the biggest challenge. So maybe in the future, yes, and there are more technical situations where machine learning is being used, you know, on the hazard side, for example, to bring different data sources in. But I think, as it's talked about in this question, that's possibly a little way down the line.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Any other questions from the floor, Tuga?
Yes, we've just got one that's come in from Stuart Fraser. Of the report recommendations shown earlier, would any of the panelists be willing to offer their top priority and explain why? I don't know if if the panelists will remember the recommendation.
If the audience will permit, the second panel discussion segment, which should be running around 8 minutes, I think, tries to take us through choose the right tools for the risk decisions being made, and really says the framework, right platform, tools, and people, what data, and really is sort of like an action, an invitation to action to the audience. And I wonder if we could ask each of the panel members to maybe synthesize Stuart's excellent question with some practical take-home advice for our audience today. And maybe take 2 or 3 minutes. We'll just go around the table. In my screen, I see Anna, Paul, Claire, and I'll just maybe call you out one after the other, and maybe give us some takeaways that the audience might think about from your own unique perspectives. So if I may start with you, Anna.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a professor, so for me, actually, is knowledge, risk transfers, and not only to students. I mean, we need to get to the people that really are on risk, and we have to make a language that is very simple. We need to be able to explain with our own words, to be aware of the risk, which is, for example, is quite difficult for us in Colombia. Always work on seismic risk, but I think there are many other risks, of course. But it's difficult for us because people don't believe that this will happen. So I think really we need to go to the population and be friendly and learn to live with the risk. So I would say risk communication would be a key.
All right. Paul, some wise advice from somebody who's been at this game for some time.
It would be another spin on that communication, I think, and the idea, I think, that if we can get everyone who's involved in making these decisions, those providing the data, those at the sharp end who are owning the risks, to be involved in the conversations as early as possible, to understand what's possible from the data point of view, what's required from the decision-making point of view. I think that does a number of things. It's a pipeline for sharing the knowledge and building the capacity of those risk owners. But I think it's also it helps to build trust, which can then follow on into better decisions at the end, more trusting decisions. So people being willing to pass on risk or take on risk depending on their role, based on the fact that they think they've got a full understanding of the picture, I think. And so that, I guess that's probably a synthesis of more than one recommendation maybe, but I think that's the area. And just to pick off a particular example of where I've kind of seen that in action to an extent would be on a project that we did with the START network in Pakistan, where there was it was clear from our perspective what things we were good at doing, and they didn't necessarily immediately align with the things that were actually of most interest to the people on the ground. So we might be talking about the ability to model river flooding well, but a lot of stakeholders were talking about the risk from flash flooding, which is a much more challenging problem. And you know, to have that conversation means that you don't ignore that concern. You might not be able to address it immediately, and you might have to discuss what you can do as a first step, but at least you're aware of it and you're acknowledging it, and then you can look to build towards addressing it in the future.
Thanks very much indeed. I see Claire on my screen. Claire, what advice would you give to our audience today?
I guess for me, it's changing kind of systematic starting point for risk analytics. Having a much clearer process of needs analysis.
Could you adjust your mic just a little bit, Claire?
Oh, sorry. Can you hear?
That's better.
So I'd say it's the starting point. It's instead of thinking what data have we got, what data would we use as the first point, it's starting right back at the beginning is what is it that we want to be able to do? When do we want to be able to do it? You know, what is the change that we want to bring about by the actions that can be triggered through analytics? Understanding and developing a much better impact design criteria on those analytics, that then the balance between what is possible and what is needed can be then met in the middle. And like Paul was saying, on the work we've done with JBA in Pakistan, the needs analysis we did there showed they wanted, the members in Pakistan wanted a model for river flooding. However, at the next year we had flash flooding, and suddenly their needs suddenly changed. So it was kind of like, they do want river flooding, but they also want flash flooding. So it's also trying to also make sure that when you talk with people, you kind of are exploring and also are adaptable in terms of that needs analysis and how analytics might need to change and adapt and things like that. So I would say the starting point needing to be the impact, and then building out from that rather than looking down to it, essentially.
Very much a people-centered approach. Oh, that's wonderful. I'll turn our attention now to Litea. I know it's quite late for you right now. Thank you for staying awake. Keep that coffee going. But from the Islander point of view, what should this all mean to our audience today?
You know, there's the standard narrative that we keep talking about risk-informed development. And for developing countries, you know, what does that actually mean? Taking a step back, you know, to actually understand what are we intending for that investment. So, you know, just to give you an example, the Marshall Islands with the World Bank determined that for a $40 million US investment, that there needed to be an investment in actually understanding what those risks were for the populace. And from that, actually 2% of that funding went towards risk analysis. So, you know, there's really an incentive here for countries to actually drive that point across, which is, do not just help us invest financing, help us also understand how we can make that investment, you know, for the generations to come following us. I mean, I can keep talking about this, but you know, that's really the bottom line, is actually understanding what those questions are that we're trying to solve with these investments that we're making, and using the tools, the risk analysis to actually try and determine what are the best approaches to then tackle it.
Thank you very much, Litea. And last but not least, of course, Catherine, I'll give you 2 minutes to solve the gender equity problems of the world via risk analytics.
Look, really the advice is to be using people-centric metrics. Policymakers have really been calling internationally for more and better use of sex disaggregated data to inform risk understanding. So I think that is critical, because that can help us to better account for these different patterns of vulnerability and exposure. But it's not just about collecting that data, it's also making sure that you use the data that's collected. We do, though, have to ensure that data platforms that are being created to inform risk understanding capture sex disaggregated data. Many of them don't at the moment, so they need to be adjusted to enable us to capture that. And then in absence of more traditional sources or you can actually turn to things like the Census and Economic Survey data, which is sex disaggregated, and to use that for the time being, and also composite indexes such as Women, Business and the Law from the World Bank, an amazing resource about the legal constraints facing women. Information like that can be useful for understanding the risk context, the gender differential risk context. And then we can also look at learning from the private sector. Sex disaggregated data is really being used by some of the private insurance companies at the moment to inform product development, to develop customer-centric insurance products to meet women's needs. It's not just about women when we talk about gender, though a gendered approach is looking at differences between men and women and considering some of these social norm related factors that inform risks. So ultimately use those people-centric metrics, ensure you're collecting that sex disaggregated data through your systems, and then apply the insights that you get through that data to inform your risk understanding. And hopefully that will better enable us to address some of these differential vulnerabilities that exist. That's what we're aiming to do.
Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the distinguished panel members today. And what I'm sort of hearing is, sort of from the very start, your framework, your responsibility to your vulnerable populations, the need to build in sort of what types and splits of data you're collecting and managing in order to reach that very ambitious 500 million vulnerable population goal of InsuResilience. From a legacy, as we hear from Latea, a word of promise from Paul, and Anna, of course, that things are moving in the direction we're expecting, and the collaboration between the public and private sectors are getting only better with the types of engagement that we're having. I'll take one more minute before giving the floor back to Nick to close us off. Just to remind everyone, so this year is both the 5th year anniversary of Sendai and of Paris. And Sendai was my sort of first UN conference at a large scale. And a good friend of mine was speaking on analytics as the currency of communication and capital transfers. And I've kept that in mind a lot because I work in climate finance. So the invitation to the crowd is to take this wonderful advice from this very distinguished panel and to go home and say, what is it that I can do tomorrow around being a better owner of risk? Okay. When you work that out, call Nick Moody and he'll tell you what to do. Nick, I give you back the floor.
Augusto, thank you. What a truly interesting panel with knowledge in such depth as well. Thank you so much for bringing it together, and thank you to each one of the panelists for not only this webinar, but also the contributions that you all made to the Development Impact of Risk Analytics report. I'd also like to thank Tuga and the team at InsuResilience Secretariat for their constant support throughout the process of generating the report, and also, of course, for co-hosting this webinar. Please do, everybody on this call, please do go to the website that you can see in front of you, the Insurance Development Forum website, go to the library tab and have a good dig around the report. As I say, it's part of a campaign, it's not just a standalone report, but you will find many of the themes that the panel have just discussed are expanded on in that report, together with recommendations about potential next steps. Tugra, do you have any last words before we sign off?
I think we're out of time. I just want to say thank you so much. It's been very interesting, and we hope to take this forward in 2021. And I wish you all good health and a very happy end to 2020.